Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, everything you need to know about elections with Secretary of State Shenna Bellows. Election Day is just a few weeks away, and we will all be heading to the polls to determine who will lead our state. With news about the elections bombarding us every day, we are absolutely thrilled to welcome Maine's Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, to share how our state is ensuring that elections are safe, secure, accessible, and accurate. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from the Secretary first and then tackle all of your questions in the Q&A at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I will keep track of them and ask them following the presentation. We ask that you not message speakers directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical issues today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all for joining us, and Madam Secretary, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be in space and community with Maine Conservation Voters and to partner with you here in Augusta to shape the laws that shape our state. I'm going to start with a story because I've been reflecting a lot on our elections and just how fortunate we are here in our state. That we have such safe, secure, accessible, and convenient elections. But it's not an accident. It's the work of many advocates and leaders over time. So I was just giving a tour of the Maine State House to Maine's student cabinet, young people from all over the state, high school students who are really the future leaders of our state. They were very excited to hear that 16-year-olds can register to vote here in Maine and then serve as poll workers on election day. Of course, on election day in November, 18-year-old, all Maine citizens 18 years and older can in fact vote. So I explained to them that registration is good for being a poll worker. And then if they're 18 by November, then they can in fact vote. But one of the other stories from the State House, it made an impact on them, and it's something I've been reflecting on. So let's go back in time, 1879. Alonzo Garcelon was the governor of Maine. Back in the day, gubernatorial terms were one-year terms. So imagine an era where the governor was always simultaneously campaigning for re-election and serving. And Alonzo Garcelon had not won with a majority of the vote. And at that time, the Constitution did in fact say that the gubernatorial nominee had to be a majority winner, or the decision would go to the legislature. So he had actually come in third in his race for governor, but then the legislature had selected him over the first and second choices. And that's how he came to be governor. So he's running for a re-election in 1879, very, very unpopular across the state. And the returns come in on election day, and it is very clear that he is not going to win re-election. So at that time, certification of the results was in the hands of something called the Executive Council, basically the governor's cabinet. And the ballots were coming in to the Executive Council, and they determined that they would examine the ballots very carefully. And they actually deemed inauthentic or invalid all of the ballots from whole towns, like Portland, for example. So their determination was, in fact, that Republicans had not won the legislature, and that, in fact, so they, by discounting all of these ballots. So you had the unusual situation of legislators who thought they were duly elected when they saw the count in their municipalities coming to the State House to be seated, and legislators who were deemed by the Executive Council as legislators. So you had essentially two different legislators descending here on the State House for a period of 12 days. Now, then Governor Garceland got nervous, and he made probably the only wise decision of this whole debacle. He appointed General Joshua Chamberlain to come to Augusta to keep the peace while this could be sorted out. So Chamberlain comes to Augusta with members of the state militia. They guard the doors of the Capitol, and there's an armed standoff. Apparently a mob is descending on the Capitol, and Chamberlain, these are in records in the Maine State Archives, goes out on the balcony, which is open today to legislators and members of the public, goes out on the balcony, opens his jacket and says, "You'll have to come through me. You're going to," and I'm summarizing or paraphrasing, but basically you're going to have to kill me to get into the State House. And reportedly a man in the crowd, a Civil War veteran, said, "Well, if you kill him, I'm going to kill you." And the crowd stood down. They did not kill Joshua Chamberlain in that moment. The peace was kept while the Maine Supreme Court heard a challenge to those election results. And the Maine Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the ballots from places like Portland should be counted. And Garceland did not serve as governor. Daniel Davis became the governor of Maine. And there was a large legislative study looking into what had happened, and the Maine Constitution was actually amended. And that is why, for those of you who are passionate advocates of ranked choice voting, like I am, the words of the Constitution are explicit. The majority is not required. And that is why for the general election for governor and for state legislative races this year, it is pick one, while on the back of your ballot in the federal election, it will be ranked choice voting. But I share this story because it was a very dangerous moment for our state. Essentially, a sitting governor was trying to steal the election by throwing out votes with him and his cronies. And it led to political violence here in our capital, the day only being saved because of the courage and the popularity of Joshua Chamberlain. And the rule of the law saved the day then. I think in these times, we're in another very troubling moment in our democracy. And we'll have a conversation about this. I'm happy to answer people's questions, but we're in really, really challenging times, and it will be the rule of law that saves our democracy. Now let's talk about Maine and where we are at and what to expect in the upcoming election. First and foremost, I say this frequently, but it is true. Mainers should be so proud. We have secure, safe, accessible, and convenient elections. We are one of the best states in the nation for voter participation. In 2020, we ranked third in the nation for voter participation. Nearly 79% of voters turned out to vote. And more than 62% of those voters cast an absentee ballot. We fell into place just behind Colorado, who was in number 2, having rolled out for the first time universal mail ballots, and Minnesota, who ranks #1. Minnesota's laws being very similar to us, having same-day voter registration, no artificial requirements for showing a specific voter ID at the polls, no excuse absentee voting, but also having some modernizations that we haven't yet seen, like online voter registration, which we hope to deploy soon. So we had a very successful 2020 election here in our state. But then, of course, no one can forget the events of January 6th, the insurrection at the US Capitol, as people who believe lies about the election and who were in fact trying to overturn the will of the people and keep Donald Trump in power, descended upon the Capitol with violence. And what we have seen since January 6th, unfortunately, is the escalation of those lies, that misinformation, malinformation, disinformation spreading across the country. And we have seen increased threats against election workers, and in some cases violence all across the nation. We have not been immune here in our state. In 2021, there were 2 documented threats against election workers, resulting in 1 successful prosecution of 1 individual who'd made death threats against an election worker, and a no trespass order against another individual who had threatened an election worker, a clerk, with a weapon. So what has Maine done, and what changes are in place, and what can we expect in 2022? So one of the huge accomplishments in the legislature, and I thank Maine conservation voters for this partnership, of course, is protections for our election workers and our clerks. Because an attack on an election worker is an attack on democracy itself. We need to have that security of knowing that the polling locations and the people who are running them are safe. And so with Representative Bruce White of Waterville and Patty Du Bois, a longtime veteran clerk of Waterville, leading the initiative, and a broad coalition, including Maine conservation voters, we passed, and Governor Mills signed into law, a protections for election workers that make it a state crime to be investigated and prosecuted by the Office of the Attorney General to threaten an election worker. An equally important measure, and I credit the ACLU for really pushing this, is training for election workers. So this year we had our first ever de-escalation training for our election clerks, walking them through expert measures to bring down the temperature in negotiations with people who are hostile or threatening. We actually had a FBI hostage negotiator co-facilitating the training with a security expert from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We are also piloting a program to do security assessments called SAFE assessments with our partners in Homeland Security of polling locations and municipal offices. So they have conducted almost 15 of those assessments all across the state with municipalities who wanted to join that pilot. And based on those early assessments, we will be rolling that out across the whole state in 2023. The good news is in 2022, it has been much quieter. We have not received those documented threats against election workers. There's been some ugly rhetoric. There have been, there was one individual who was calling my office incessantly, saying some pretty ludicrous and vaguely threatening things. But we haven't seen threats that have risen to the level of what we saw in 2021 or what some of my colleagues across the country have seen. And the preparations that we're making, we feel confident that our clerks will have some of the tools they need, and that we have some of the procedures and plans in place to support them to ensure security at the polls on election day. The other thing that we saw in the wake of the big lie and the insurrection of the Capitol are efforts by unscrupulous individuals to thwart the integrity of our elections, to compromise the ballots, the machines themselves. And of course, we saw the fraudulent fake audit or fraudit in Arizona, where Cyber Ninja, the now bankrupt and defunct shadowy operation, was granted access to ballots and tabulators by the Arizona legislature in a really partisan move. And they actually removed some of that equipment from the state. They actually defaced some of the ballots, making marks on them. So we, under the leadership of Representative Teresa Peirce and support from the coalition led by Maine Conservation Voters, you hear a theme here, passed a strong chain of custody law to ensure that the chain of custody for ballots and equipment is secured, that equipment and those ballots can never be turned over to a third party entity, and that we are making sure, and of course in Maine, we'd never experienced any problems with the chain of custody like what we are seeing in Arizona, actually in Colorado and Michigan with rogue, sometimes clerks, sometimes legislators or politicians compromising equipment and ballots. So we're very fortunate, but we've also put strong chain of custody laws in place. I also want to give a shout out to Senator Nicole Grahowski and again, Maine Conservation Voters and the Voting Rights Coalition for work to successfully pass a post-election audits law that stands up a new training and audits team. Now, we won't be doing a post-election audit of 2022. The law provides for us to roll that out in time for audits, valid audits, real audits overseen by the Secretary of State's office for 2024. So those are some of the measures that we've implemented to advance security and safety of our elections moving forward. What about convenience and accessibility? As a former head of ACLU, accessibility is near and dear to my heart. We can be so proud in Maine that we are one of only 2 states in the nation where every citizen has 18 years or older, a resident of Maine has the constitutional right to vote and never loses that for any reason. So to increase convenience and security, we have seen, we've codified putting into law some of the innovations that were developed in the pandemic, like, for example, absentee ballot drop boxes. We just manufactured enough absentee ballot drop boxes so that every municipality in the state could have one if they so desired. Now, those are voluntary, and we just sent out 52 of those drop boxes to municipalities across the state that didn't previously have one. Of course, many municipalities already had a drop box. We are also seeing, we also passed a law to say that municipalities could request a second drop box. So we have seen that happen in a couple of municipalities as well. So that if you're voting absentee under our no excuse absentee voting law, you can return your ballot in person, you can put it in the mail, or you can return it in the absentee ballot drop box. And an election worker in our state office who commutes to work here in Augusta every day said she is so grateful for the absentee ballot drop box in her municipality because she knows that that's where she can return her ballot and know it will get there on time, because her work schedule, including on election day, does not allow her to go in person on election day. And of course, we know the Postal Service mail delivery is slower than it's been in decades past, due, unfortunately, to changes at the U.S. Postal Service. Other things that we've implemented: automatic voter registration. So now at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, when you go to update your license or get a new license, and we are seeing tremendous in-migration into the state, actually visitors to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles over the summer ranged in increase over summers past, 22% in June, and double-digit increases in visits to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So now when those new Mainers coming to our state come to get their license or Maine ID, we are registering them to vote or updating their voter registration. So that's another really exciting innovation. And then for accessibility, we have an online accessible ballot for voters with print disabilities. This was an innovation again in 2020 in response to litigation by Disability Rights Maine in 2020. And now that online accessible ballot is available to voters with disabilities, complementing what we already had rolled out, which is express voting machines for voters with disabilities all across the state in polling locations. So those are some of the innovations, and we are so grateful to the legislature for that work. Some things you won't see in 2022, but get ready for 2024. Under the leadership, again, of Representative Teresa Peirce, we were able to advance online voter registration. So as we speak, our team is working on a new central voter registration system. And as part of that central voter registration system, we will have online voter registration so that voters can register to vote from the convenience of their phone or their computer at home. Additionally, under Speaker Ryan Fecto's leadership, we will be rolling out for 2024 ongoing absentee voting. Now, our military and overseas voters already enjoy an ongoing absentee voting situation, essentially a Yokava vote. When they apply, they can get that ballot mailed to them for successive elections over an 18-month period. That's federal law. Under this law, with ongoing absentee voting, seniors and people with disabilities who prefer to always vote absentee can fill out an application and then have a ballot mailed to them without future applications. So we're really excited about that. So those are some of the innovations. I will also say there's some programmatic changes that we have made. I'm really excited to say one of the security measures that we passed was joining the ERIC, an interstate collaborative that exchanges voter information so that we can identify if people pass away in another state or move and register to another state. We can perform that list maintenance, know that, oh, okay, this voter's moved to Florida, we'll remove them from the Maine rolls. One of the benefits of ERIC is we've been doing some work matching our driver license and ID system to our voter registration system. And we identified every Maine citizen who is in that system, in the license or ID system, who is not registered to vote. And we sent them a postcard saying, our records show you may not be registered. Here's how you can register, register to vote today and participate in the November election. We've also been doing a lot of student outreach to colleges and universities. I was at Bates College last night, for example. We mailed voter registration cards to every campus in the state, as well as all of the high schools in the state, junior and seniors, so that schools can distribute voter registration cards and ensure that students have that opportunity to register. And finally, we are very mindful about people who are incarcerated. And so with Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, we visited Maine State Prison and Wyndham Correctional Facilities. My team, including myself, also visited Mountain View at Charleston Correctional Facilities to ensure that people who are currently incarcerated have that opportunity to register to vote and apply for an absentee ballot. So those are some of the programmatic changes that we are also implementing to ensure that every Maine citizen has the right, 18 years and older, has the right to register to vote, cast their ballot, and know that their vote will be counted. We're so excited. Our June primary election was very smooth, very secure. We anticipate the same for November. It's a big year and we're excited to be part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Secretary. It is just absolutely, it is so heartwarming to know how much we have to be proud of in Maine, and also that we're not resting on our laurels. So thank you for your leadership. I want to share a quick call to action before we get into questions. I don't think it's going to surprise anybody, but we are hoping that today you will make your plan to vote. So that might mean you need to stop by your municipal office and update your voter registration. You don't have to do that. You can always do it on election day. You might want to request an absentee ballot. You might want to just stop by and do in-person absentee voting, which is sort of our workaround for early voting here in Maine. But whatever your plan is going to be, please set that plan in motion today. And once your voting plans are locked down, check with your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, the folks at the dog park, strangers on the street. See if we can top those really impressive voter turnout numbers that Maine is right to be proud of. But we're not going to stop until they're 100%. So help us out with that project. And as always, you will all get an email later this afternoon with a bunch of links that will make it easy for you to take those steps. And also there is a vote411.org, which is a great resource where you can actually put in your zip code and find out what is going to be on your local ballot. So if you live in a place like Portland, where there are a whole slew of ballot measures, do your homework beforehand so that you're not standing in the voting booth thinking, what in the heck do all of these things mean? So thank you very much. And just a reminder that you can keep those questions coming through the chat. Secretary Bellows, I wanted to start off with just thanking you for sharing that story about Maine's historical big lie. I had never heard that before. And it's, I don't know if it's helpful or tragic to realize that this is not an entirely unprecedented moment that we're living in. But I am curious about how you and your fellow secretaries of state, because I assume you all talk to each other, are thinking about taking care of our democracy. And I know that there are, in some states, I think a group in Ohio asked the Secretary of State there to strike candidates from the ballot if they support the big lie. I'm curious if you've heard about those kinds of steps and if that has crossed your mind here in Maine.
So we have been approached and requests have been made that we remove candidates from the ballot who have endorsed the big lie. We do not see the ability in the Maine Constitution or Maine statute to remove candidates from ballots because of an affiliation with any ideology or even a criminal record. And so I really do think that decisions about who to support or not support are going to lie with the voters this November. And I do think it's incredibly important to be evaluating the positions of candidates toward democracy itself. Emily Cook, my communications director, and I have been working really hard to make sure that the Maine media has accurate information about our elections and that we are being very forceful in confronting any lies or disinformation that is being spread. And fortunately, we've been able to successfully knock down some of the myths that get perpetrated. And that's important because unfortunately, what happens is when people believe lies, then A, they disengage, or B, more concerning, that's what leads to these threats of violence and acts of violence against our election workers in our polling places, or illegal attempts to subvert the elections themselves. Now, in terms of other secretaries and collaboration, I want to mention a couple of things that I think are really important. So most recently, so in November, the Supreme Court will be hearing the case of Moore versus Harper. This is really an unprecedented Supreme Court case. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not a lawyer at all, for that matter. I just used to play one on TV when I was head of the ACLU. But I'll give a summary of it and why I find it so alarming and why fellow secretaries and I are looking to collaborate in providing a friend of the court amicus brief to the Supreme Court on this issue. So it's a redistricting case. And the US Supreme Court had previously basically punted on the issue of gerrymandering and sent that back to the states and said it was really the purview of the state Supreme Courts. Well, we just went through redistricting and actually proud to say, go Maine. We were second in the nation to pass our redistricting maps. And part of that is because we have an independent redistricting commission that is equal numbers, we call it apportionment, equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. And then together, those members choose a single independent or unenrolled chair of the commission. And they have to agree on those maps, and then they go to the legislature. So you don't see gerrymandering in Maine because of the integrity of that process. But in lots of states, there was gerrymandering, for sure. And in North Carolina, there were horribly gerrymandered maps. Civil rights groups challenged those maps to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which ruled that the maps were unconstitutional under the North Carolina state constitution. And normally that would be the end of it. What's very concerning is usually the Supreme Court takes cases if two jurisdictions are in disagreement with each other, or if a lower court or a state Supreme Court is making a decision that is contrary to all established precedent. But the North Carolina Supreme Court's decision is not contrary to existing precedent, and it's certainly not in conflict with other courts around the country. It's a North Carolina specific redistricting issue. And when they took that case, it was Republicans who sued and appealed to the US Supreme Court. And when they took that case, the appellants are making the argument of the independent state legislature theory. And what they're arguing is that the US Constitution gives the authority to state legislatures and state legislatures only to determine the election laws within their state that govern elections. And what they're arguing is that those state legislatures aren't subject to oversight by the state Supreme Court or any court, and that they have that sole authority, which, if you take it to its logical extension, means that secretaries of state do not have the authority to certify elections, and that state legislatures could do whatever they want. So think about things that are in Maine's Constitution, like the unique right to vote for every Maine citizen, including people who are incarcerated or people with felony convictions. That's in our Constitution. If the independent state legislature theory prevails, one could imagine that that would be overturned. It's really terrifying. So I've been collaborating with other secretaries of state. We've been having many conversations about this, and it is our intention to challenge this and hopefully prevail in the Supreme Court with others to deter them from overturning historical precedent and going in this direction. There are other collaborations as well. So Republican Secretary of Ohio, Frank LaRose, and I, we co-chair a national task force on healthy democracy. We've been looking at issues of civics education and reforms that Republicans and Democrats can agree on. We've been part of this working group for 2 years, and that means structured, ongoing conversations. We've been doing research. We've been exchanging best practices. It's been a really fascinating process. He and I also serve on the Election Infrastructure and Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's a very obscure name for a state, federal, and local partnership. It's a collaboration across agencies at every level, and looking at election infrastructure security issues. So we've been collaborating on cybersecurity issues and protective security measures, doing a lot of, again, research, policymaking, best practices, information sharing. So that type of collaboration happens all the time, and it gives me hope and faith and confidence in the future of our elections, not just here in Maine, but across the country.
That is so fascinating. And I just love that while your job may be focusing on Maine's democracy and our elections, it's also collaborating nationwide to make sure that our entire country has safe and secure elections. One of the things that I've heard folks wonder about in terms of healthy democracy and accessible democracy is the wording of ballot questions. How many of us have stood there thinking, what does this even say? Can you tell us a little bit about how the questions get put on the ballot, whether it's local ballot questions or statewide, and how we can figure out what they're actually asking us?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to make sure that everyone realizes, so if you're living in some municipalities, you will see ballot questions. Portland, I believe, has 13 ballot questions on their ballot. Someone can correct me in the chat if I misstated that, but I think that's right. But at the state level, there are no referendum questions this election. So in 2021, we did see some ballot measures, and we will likely see some ballot measures again in 2023 and potentially 2024. This was an obscure and interesting part of my job. So first and foremost, the text of the legislation itself, what the ballot measure is about, is something that is really the purview of the group of people that is bringing the ballot measure. So they bring forward proposed legislation. We refer it to the revisor's office to ensure that it's written in proper legislative form. but the substance of that legislation is not something that we or the revisor's office shape in any way. We can make a determination about whether that question should be divided into multiple questions, but that's only a recommendation to the people bringing the ballot measure. So that's just an interesting small fact. Then they go out and they collect signatures. Then our office must very painstakingly check every single one of those signatures. We check for duplicates, we check against fraud. And in fact, we have seen ballot measures that unfortunately have had that in the past. And we verify every signature on those ballot measures. So that's a huge job. We do it in teams of 2. So it's not individuals looking at that. When we're looking at duplicates, it's 2 people working in pairs, making, looking at those 2 signatures to identify if they're the same or different. And then if we determine that it is authorized for the ballot, then the Secretary of State has the discretion to write the question. However, there's some limitations on the question. So sometimes people are like, why does yes mean no? And no sometimes mean yes. Well, that is written into state statute. And so the question has to be, do you support doing this? So if the doing something is stopping something, that's when you have a question that can be somewhat counterintuitive. And then in terms of writing the question has to capture all of the components of the legislation. Now, the legislation itself is often very technical and very lengthy. And our job is to make sure that every aspect of that legislation, even if it's multiple parts, is captured in a single question. That means those questions can be really long. And then the other piece that often happens is we are actually trying to compare this with objective measures of readability and literacy. Although it doesn't always seem like it, that is something that we are testing the question again. Then we publish the question for public comment. So at that point, members of the public can give feedback on the question. They can give suggestions on how to make it better. And then I, as secretary, have to review all of those comments, all of that feedback, and make any appropriate edits to the question before final issuance. Usually, I do not do this by myself in a room, or even here in the secretary's office. What my practice, as the practice of my predecessors has been, is to put together a committee at the state level, usually involving the Office of the Attorney General, to make sure that we're meeting the legal statutory requirements, and our civil service professionals in the elections office.
So there's a very robust and thoughtful process, and sometimes we still end up with a question that we need to do a little homework to be truly prepared.
That's right. And I will say, just, the local municipal referendums, I don't have any role in drafting them.
Okay.
And similarly, constitutional amendments. So sometimes people say, well, why can't we just amend the Constitution to make ranked choice voting apply to governor and the state legislature in the general election? And the answer is constitutional amendments have to originate in the legislature. And because a constitutional amendment originates in the legislature, it is the legislature that writes the language of constitutional amendments before going out to the people.
Okay. And since you mentioned that would be a way that we could expand ranked choice voting, remind us again, which races do we use ranked choice voting and which ones do we not?
So hopefully we've made it as simple as possible. Ranked choice voting in the general election is only for federal races. In the primary, it's for all races, but in the November election and the general election, it's only for federal races. That is because of a decision by the Maine Supreme Court, because of language in our Constitution, which dates back to that 1880 change following our little mini big lie and insurrection at our own state capitol. So hopefully we've made it as clear as possible. And there are sample ballots on our website. So if you have questions, last night I was speaking at Bates and a student who is a first year said, I have no idea who's running for office. How do I get that information? And I said, go to our website. We have the candidate. We have a voter information lookup feature. You can go look, type in your address and you will see who will be on your ballot. You can even see a sample ballot, and then you can do your research. And there are a variety of nonpartisan resources as well as the more partisan ones to identify who those candidates are. Another student said, the question we often get asked is, can we, have our phone if we're in the voting booth, behind the curtain, can we be like looking it up? Like, is there a time limit on filling out your ballot? And of course, the answer is there is no time limit. You can be in the voting booth, going online, trying to make a determination about who you want to vote for. But so on one side of the ballot, what you'll see is the governor's race at the top, state legislative races, and then any applicable county races. And then on the back side of the ballot is the federal ranked choice voting race. And you will see that in both Congressional District 1 and Congressional District 2. That's because in Congressional District 1, we have Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, Republican Ed Thielander, and a declared write-in, independent Alan West. So that has created a line for write-in candidate, which makes that ballot a ranked choice voting ballot. And then in Congressional District 2, again, it's a ranked choice voting race between Jared Golden, Bruce Poliquin, and Tiffany Bond. There's a line for write-in as well. And that is a ranked choice voting ballot. So the front side of the ballot, it's picked one. On the back side of the ballot, it is ranked choice voting. And we hope that separation will help people process that it's a different style and that it's a different process. Then, of course, the municipal ballots are a separate ballot.
Thank you. That's so helpful, because I think we all, we did a lot of wrapping our head around how do I fill out a ranked choice ballot, and then, well, you don't get to for every race, but that's okay. Yeah. And thanks for explaining that. That's super helpful. Talking about voting on, well, it does seem like absentee voting and voting by mail has become so popular in the last few years. And I suspect COVID has a lot to do with it, but we didn't invent absentee voting during COVID, right? It existed before. So how long has Maine used this system, and why is it so popular?
Oh, I want to just clarify. I misspoke. It's not Alan West, it's Alan McDonald.
I didn't even catch that. Thank you.
But why is absentee voting so popular? I think it's because of convenience, right? So, a lot of people work full time and they're commuting to work, like people in my election office, maybe an hour and a half each way. They may be caring for family members, for children, or for seniors or people with disabilities in their home. They may travel frequently for work, or they may just prefer getting it out of the way so that their name comes off the lists for political families, or they may just be done, right? They want to make their decision and move on. And so for a variety of reasons, voting early via the absentee process is a convenient option for Mainers. And we've always seen, well, let me rephrase. In prior gubernatorial elections, prior to 2020, we did see a number of absentee ballots, usually 20%, 22%. In 2018, the last gubernatorial matchup, when Janet Mills was first elected, she was running against Sean Moody, and 29% of voters voted absentee in that year. And then the pandemic, obviously for safety reasons, for health reasons, absentee voting exploded. Just over 62% of the voters who turned out in that election voted absentee, which is remarkable. So this year, actually, we just got the most recent numbers. So far to date this year, 332 people have requested their absentee ballot. And one of the innovations of 2020 that we have codified into law and put online is an online absentee ballot request system with a tracker. So you can go online to our website, request your absentee ballot, and then track its progress after you fill it out and return it to your municipal office, either via the mail or in a Dropbox if your municipality has one, or in person. you can then track its status and make sure that it was accepted by the municipality. So having, it's pretty significant to see already more than 100,000 absentee voters. That's over half of what we saw in 2018. So if that trend continues, I think we'll be well above 30% of the voters voting absentee. And of course, your vote counts equally. So one of the questions that I often get is like, so what about ballot stuffing? And this comes from disinformation, right? This comes from lies that are being told. It's like, well, what are the protections? Are absentee ballot drop boxes safe? Well, in the checks and balances that enable the absentee ballot tracking system also enable checks and balances by the clerk and our state office. So when those requests are made, the clerk is recording that request in the central voter registration system. And the ballot comes with a return envelope, and voters have to sign that return envelope on the back. That ensures that every ballot is matched to a person who has made that request. And that is one of the safeguards against interception of that ballot. It's also the reason that ballots can't just be stuffed in an absentee ballot drop box, because a ballot can't be accepted unless it's in the absentee ballot envelope. Now, a clerk isn't sitting in her office by herself, just opening those envelopes as they come in, being like, oh, there's another vote for Mills, there's another vote for LePage, oh, there's a vote for Hunkler. That's not how it happens. The clerks can process those absentee ballots ahead of time, but they have to announce that they're doing so to both of the political parties. So parties can have observers present, and the processing is not counting. The counting happens after the polls close at 8 o'clock on election day. The processing is simply the process of opening those envelopes. So you have 2 election workers, and then you have observers from the parties watching the process, and they're opening the envelopes, and they're not counting the ballot in that moment. So they're not opening the envelope and saying, oh, John Doe voted for this person. They are opening the envelope and setting the ballot aside in piles. And then those ballots will get counted. They will get tabulated on election night, but they're just checking off and ensuring, separating the ballots from the envelopes and then securing those ballots until they can be counted on election day. So that's the process. Those are some of the security that prevent, ballot stuffing, for example, and can ensure that people know that their ballot will be counted, regardless of whether they vote absentee or whether they vote on election day.
And have we seen the drop boxes are such a great innovation, and at the same time, they're just sitting out there on the street corner. Have we seen any vandalism or any problems with those, or is everything going well?
Well, in the special election where Representative Jim Boyle was elected last winter, we did have an absentee ballot drop box get plowed over by a snowplow. It was an accident. It was during a storm. But fun fact, so the drop boxes are made to specific standards. None of the ballots were damaged. So the drop box was a mess, but the municipality was able to open the mangled drop box and retrieve those ballots, and not a single one was damaged. There are
like the snow plow, like that is just the maniest story of drop box mishaps. I love it.
Yeah, it was reportedly very hard to get those ballots out. I will just say it was. So anybody watching at home that thinks, oh, I'll just take my snowplow out to, get the ballots. It was very difficult to get those ballots out, but they were retrieved. They were retrieved successfully, and their integrity was protected. So they're well designed. This is part of the process. The statute does provide that municipalities are encouraged to have security cameras, many do, or law enforcement presence, doing regular check-ins on those boxes, or municipal personnel on site on a regular basis checking those boxes. And of course, when absentee voting is happening, the municipal clerks and their deputies are routinely going to retrieve those ballots and checking on that box. Additionally, the siting of those ballot drop boxes it needs to be adjacent to a municipal office or municipal property, or for the second ballot drop box needs to be approved by the Secretary of State's office in terms of the security of that location.
So I know one of the great things about Maine's election laws is it is possible to show up on election day and register to vote. Is there what's in the works to make registering to vote easier if you don't want to wait for election day?
Registering to vote, if you don't want to wait until election day, you can go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and use automatic voter registration. If you are updating your license, you can't just go to the motor vehicles to register to vote. It needs to be a motor vehicles transaction, because otherwise the customer service representative is going to be like, well, what are you here for? You're here for a motor vehicle transaction. That under the law, those will be accepted and transmitted to the clerks up to and including on October 18th. October 18th is the 21-day cutoff prior to election day. After the 18th, we'll still be accepting those voter registrations, but the clerks have no way to process who has registered to vote in that 21-day window. And that window exists so that when the clerks create their voter participation list, the list of registered voters, they can have confidence in the accuracy of that list. So if you're registering to vote at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles after the 18th, you also have to go in person. Similarly, with voter registration cards, there are a lot of organizations that are doing voter registration drives and collecting those cards. Again, under the law, the clerks must accept all cards that are received on October 18th, but after the 18th, the voter really does need to be in person before the clerk to ensure that they're added to the list that is printed as the official voter registration list for election day. So that's why same-day voter registration is so important too, right? Because it's like, well, what do you do if you can't register by the 18th? Well, you can register in person. And then the clerk is seeing you, they're putting eyes on you, they're automatically adding you to the list in that moment. And that includes on election day. So you can use a card, fill out a card and return it to the clerk. You can go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles or you can register in person. You do, one of the pieces of, I would say, malinformation is this whole debate around voter ID, right? So one of the pieces of disinformation, one of the lies that is said is that we have no way of, verifying that people are citizens or residents of Maine, or that they're even who they say they are. They could, register to vote on multiple different names in multiple different towns. And that's just not true, because to register to vote, you need proof of identity and proof of residency. And you have to affirm that you're a United States citizen and that you're at least 18 years of age on the general election day. So at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, for example, we're already verifying residency and identity and citizenship and legal status. So that's actually a very secure transaction, but the clerks are also requiring that documentation. And for ID, it can be a student ID, it can be a tribal ID. Those are some innovations that we passed just this last year with Maine Conservation Voters' help. And for residency, it can be a variety of things as well. Your license actually has your street address on it. So that could be your proof of residency and your proof of identity, but you do need that to register to vote. What you don't need on election day is, to show something specific that your volunteer poll workers who are from both parties, Republican and Democrat, who are not trained, can look at and use as a reason to turn you away. And that's what happens in other states. And that's why you see long lines. Why are there long lines in Georgia? Well, think about it for a moment. There are volunteer poll workers who are having to agree that the ID is valid. And who are they turning away? Usually it's Black and brown people, So we don't require a voter ID at the polls on election day, because what that would prevent would be impersonation, people going to vote in somebody else's name. And we have ever had impersonation fraud here in Maine. Well, yes, in 2020, one woman voted in her roommate's name. She intercepted her roommate's absentee ballot. Guess what? She was caught and she now has a felony on her record. It just doesn't happen. And that's why what voter ID at the polls is used for is voter suppression.
Got it. Got it. And there are a lot of folks in Maine who spend part of the year elsewhere, right? Who may winter in Florida, like one of our gubernatorial candidates. How do you make sure that you're a full-time resident of Maine in order to vote?
So residency for purposes of elections is different than residency for purposes of taxes or tuition or vehicle registration. So it is illegal to vote in two places, right? So if someone votes in Florida and votes in Maine in the same year, they will get caught, especially now because we're using ERIC, the Interstate Collaborative. And actually this year we will exchange files with other states to match names and information and identify if anyone has voted in two different states. So that is an innovation that technology has facilitated that didn't exist in the same way before. Before it depended on reports or investigations or suspicions. So again, there's a country song, most people are good. Most people are good, most people are not trying to thwart the rules, and people who do break the law are usually caught. But we have a lot of confidence that that's not happening. But at the end of the day, we are not measuring a certain number of days. Your residency is that you have a home here, that this is where you've declared your home, that this is where you intend to return. And that applies to students, and it applies to people who have two homes.
We have just a couple more minutes, and I'm curious, what does election day look like for you?
Election day is one of my favorite days. So
tell us
when I
all
was
about
a senator, it was just the towns in my district, and it was a pretty easy circuit to go to every single town in my district. As Secretary of State, and shake hands with voters and talk to clerks and see how things were going. As Secretary of State, I can't go to every town in the state, but I always do a road show. My predecessor, Matt Dunlap, did the same thing, visiting different clerks, different municipalities to see how things are going, check in with them, support them, talk to voters. And then also make sure that we're having frequent conversations with the media so that people are aware it's election day. I know everybody on this Zoom is well aware, but a lot of average folks are living their lives and might forget. So really trying to do our best to publicize that it's election day, to publicize when the polls are open, to make sure people know that they have the right to vote, that they can go. If they're standing in line at 8:00 p.m., they will be admitted to the polling place and allowed to vote. Those types of things. And then also, our elections division, our civil service election staff are handling all calls and concerns from clerks or advocates, members of the public, if there's anything, and sometimes it's nothing at all. I remember last November, it was a poll watcher who had a pretty objectionable t-shirt, but it wasn't an illegal t-shirt that they were wearing. You can't have candidate, names or information, anything that's on the ballot. You can have reference to that at the polls, but you can have certain other things at the polls, unfortunately. Sometimes it's minor things like that really don't matter. Sometimes it's slightly more major. A tabulator battery dies, and suddenly, they're collecting. We're rushing out a new battery to replace the battery. Again, that's not a crisis because the votes aren't getting counted until after the polls close on 8 p.m. But of course, it's smoother when voters are able to just place their own ballot in the tabulator. So, things large and small, and those are questions that I'm sometimes receiving, or our election staff are always receiving. And, so there's frequent communication with my team, with the Office of the Attorney General. And then we also have a security, situation room. For cybersecurity issues, there's a situation room virtually, and for protective security issues and emergency issues as well. The June primaries were very smooth. The last November referendum election was very smooth. I think we can anticipate more of the same. And it's one of the best days of the year. It's a year that every single one of us, every single citizen in our state has that opportunity to make our voice heard, to participate in our democracy.
I love election day too, and I am so grateful for your enthusiasm for democracy, your hard work to make sure that our elections are safe and secure and accessible. And let's all do our best to get Maine's voter turnout as close to 100% as we possibly can. Thank you so much, Secretary Bellows. You are a champ, and we are just so appreciative of all you do. And also, thanks to all of you. I'm so glad that you joined us today. You will get an email later this afternoon with a whole bunch of helpful links, including the link to this recording. So I know there are folks all over the state struggling with power outages right now. If you know somebody who should have been on here but is sitting in the dark, send them this link when you get it. Thank you all. Have a safe and hopefully a little drier than it is today weekend.